quickly about H.L. Mencken.
Yeah, I know. Mencken was... I don't know if there is a British equivalent to him, really. He was a historian journalist in a style that we don't really have. I first really was forced to read him, at the risk of name-dropping. Now, I like this name-drop because it actually has a sort of echoing name-drop, which is almost unbelievable. When I was at university, we discovered that a drama club, of which I was president, was 50 years old. It was called the Mummers. It was called the Cambridge Mummers. And the secretary said to me, "Oh, Stephen, it's the 50th anniversary, we ought to have a party." I said, "Oh, very good idea." And I said, "We were founded," this was in 1980, I said, "we were founded in 1930, weren't we, by Allister Cook. Why don't I write to him and see if he's by any chance in Britain, he might come to, we'll have a party, we'll have a sort of dinner or something to celebrate 50 years. So I wrote, "Dear Mr. Cook," I wrote it to care of BBC Rockefeller Tower, New York, because I knew somehow that's where the BBC in New York was. So if you happen to be in Cambridge or in England during any time in this, whatever it was, the drama club that you founded 50 years ago, still going strong, you might be pleased to know, and we're having a party. And I got a letter back saying, "Dear Mr. Fry, thank you for writing to me. I had no plans whatsoever to be in Britain, but I've decided to come over anyway to be at your party." I thought, wow, that's very exciting. So he came, and it was fabulous. And he was very touched that the club still existed and that we'd remembered he'd founded it. And he was, of course, everything that you would hope Allister Cook would be. And at one point, he said to me, I'll tell you the reason I'm name-dropping is relevant. He said to me at one point, he said, "Shake my hand." He said, "That hand you are shaking." Shook the hand of Bertrand Russell. I said, "Wow." He said, no, there's more to it than that. Bertrand Russell's aunt danced with Napoleon. Wow. I shook the hand of a man who shook the hand of a man whose aunt danced with Napoleon. And he said, Bertrand Russell was a friend of Robert Browning. Again, and I just thought, isn't that fabulous? He really understood history in that way, Allister Cook. Anyway, at one point he would write on a napkin every now and again until his napkin had about 4 lines on it. And his speech, when he gave it, was like a letter from America, but 4 times longer, and absolutely perfect, with not a word out of place, utterly apropos, completely brilliant. I've never been so blown away by such a marvellous man. He really was. And then, before he left, he just did something in my jacket. And only when I got back to my rooms that night, he'd given a cheque for £5,000. It said, "Only to be spent on parties." He was a really marvellous man. But anyway, he said at one point, we were in Trinity Hall, and he said, where is the men's room? And I said, "Oh, it's sort of around." He said, "Well, are you coming?" I said, oh right, okay. And it turns out that men of his generation who've been used to living most of their lives in America, they regard rather as we imagine women do, as going to the men's room as rather a sort of occasion. So we went to the men's room. He had a pee, I had a pee. He then stood in front of me, then started combing his hair and washing his hands, and then he sat sort of on the wash hand basin and said, "So, tell me about yourself, young man." And I said, "God, so little to tell, really." And he carried on. He said, "What do you read?" He carried on. He said, "What do you read?" And I talked about the fact that I was reading English literature, therefore I tend to be rather dull and read, novels and poems and plays and the things that I'm supposed to read. He said, "Oh no, if you read English literature, you have to read history. Who are your favourite historians?" And I sort of burbled about Macaulay and Froude and sort of Elton and a few others that I'd heard of and occasionally had read. And he said, "What about Mencken?" I said, "I've never menked. What do I say here?" He said, "H.L. Mencken, read H.L. Mencken. He will change your life." He said, I won't be satisfied until you write to me and tell me that you've read H.L. Mencken. So I went to Heffer's, the bookshop in Cambridge, and bought a collected Mencken and read essays by him. And it's true, he is Americans, if you go to Washington, what do you see? You see a city that self-consciously tries to be like Rome. Its architecture is Roman. And Mencken he's in the tradition of Livy and Tacitus, isn't he? I mean, that's his style. There's a grand imperial nature to him that no Briton would ever dare achieve, but it's a civilized and fascinating. I don't know what he'd make of current America, but I'll just pinch the loaf, as it were, on Allister Cook by telling quite a good story. At least I think it's a reasonable story. He's just one of those men, Allister Cook. I was very pleased to know him. A good example of how he's one of those men is he told a story about how, after founding the... Actually, God, I will carry on now, anecdotage. When he founded the Mummers, the drama club, he very grandly sort of auditioned people, and he said, I remember there was some student from Jesus College, and he came and he read a piece, and I said, and what are you reading? He said, architecture. And I said, well, you carry on reading architecture. I'm sure you'll make a very fine architecture. He said, architect. He said, and every time I bump into James Mason, he reminds me of that story. But he said how that summer he went on a walking tour of Germany. He went to the, in the way that students did in those days. They'd take a pile of books and they'd wrap them up in a sort of leather strap and put them on their back, and then they'd just sort of hike around. Rather like Robert Donat in Goodbye, Mr. Chips, if you remember that section of the film. And they went into this beer garden, and they were sitting drinking beer, and it was a nice summer's day in Bavaria or whatever. And an ambulance arrived, and then about 3 ambulances arrived, and these people got out, and they pulled out stretchers, and then chairs were being arranged in the beer garden. They thought, what the hell's going on here? This is very odd. All these chairs being like, it's going to be a concert. Maybe they're an Oompa band. That'll be rather nice. But about 5 ambulances eventually had turned up. It's very strange. And then people arrived, and all the chairs were filled. And then suddenly there was a flurry, and an open-top Mercedes arrived with a few people on it, and this man marched down the middle, brushing against Allister Cook as he went. And he said, I can still remember him brushing against me, and I think, ridiculous man. And the man got up and stood on a box and went, 10 Minuten nach Mitternacht, 10 minutes to midnight. That's what he remembered was the sort of main part of his... And sure enough, every now and then, some of the women and even some of the men in the audience began to faint. And the ambulance people took them and put them on their stretchers and put them in the back. And as Allister Cook said, and there he was in front of me. He brushed me. Hitler, I could have killed him. And that's typical of Allister Cook. He just had that kind of life. He was in the hotel when Bobby Kennedy got shot and killed. He just was one of those observers. Do you know how in literature there are people like Nick in The Great Gatsby, people who watch, people who are... You kind of secretly love those characters. They're not the hero. They don't propel the story. They merely watch the story. And Allister Cook watched it. And sometimes a good chronicler is better than the greatest actor alive. And he was that sort of a man.
So this is slightly